All right, last video of the last week here. We're starting, we're kind of moving out of this pointillism into Seurat to a few other post-impressionists, including Gauguin, and then we will end with Van Gogh and Cezanne. This group of post-impressionists, it's a kind of catch-all for the next generation after Impressionists. They're not necessarily a cohesive group like the Impressionists were. Gauguin actually, he leaves Europe for Tahiti in 1891. And at this time, Tahiti was a French colony. It had been colonized by France in 18, I'm sorry, he left in 1891. Tahiti was colonized in 1881. And by the time Gauguin arrived, although we might think of his images of Tahiti and his works as a kind of unblemished Eden, a paradise, Tahiti was far from that in 1891. There were, in fact, few indigenous Tahitians left. Two-thirds of the Tahitian population were killed by disease, and the colorful fabrics that we see in Gauguin's Tahitian work are not authentic. They were manufactured in Europe. And so this fantasy of Gauguin to find an alternative way of living, something that's more in tune with nature outside of Europe, this kind of pre-modern, pure, authentic life, it never, the real story is much more complicated, and it's about imperialism. Gauguin focuses on nude women. This is a little bit of a kind of growth of Orientalism, this idea of non-European female nudes in art, that the idea that they're uninhibited, they're sexualized, they're not prudish about nudity, they live close to nature. This is really part of a primitive fantasy. And in fact, the ism that develops out of Orientalism is called primitivism. This idea that a female nude becomes inextricably connected with the fantasy of an untainted paradise. And you might be looking at this work here thinking, this looks very similar to Manet's Olympia, and you'd be right. In fact, Gauguin, one of the few things he brought with him was a print, a small cheap print of Manet's Olympia, and he wants to do his own version of this seminal work. We see, instead of a Parisian pale-skinned prostitute, we see an indigenous Tahitian woman. Instead of the African servant, we see this spirit, this kind of exotic figure here looking over the scene. We have these brightly colored fabrics that look authentic, but of course they are not. They are colonial imports. She's not guarded, she's not aggressive, but instead she almost appears to be sleeping, almost kind of unaware of the presence of the viewer. Continuing this idea of the kind of exotic and erotic combination in primitivism. This work might surprise you a little bit because, of course, something like Night Cafe is something that we more clearly associate with Van Gogh. But he starts his work in his native Netherlands, and it shows his work from the 1880s. Early 1880s really shows the economic depression of that time, the hardship for peasants. Look at this kind of hostile interior, the muddy palette, this kind of grim, very meager meal of cut up potatoes. In the following year, he travels to Paris. He lives with his younger brother Theo, who is an art dealer, and he sees the latest developments in avant-garde art, in post-impressionism. And this is when he lightens his palette, he primes his canvas in white, he uses unmixed pigment, and we see the work that he is more famous for today. This is not actually done in Paris, but he actually goes to southern France. He travels to Arles, A-R-L-E-S, and sets up an artistic community. He wants to remove the role of the dealer in commercialism, and he invites Gauguin actually to join him. So this is actually before Gauguin goes to Tahiti. And Van Gogh paints the Night Cafe in 1888, and he describes this scene. He wrote many letters to his brother Theo, and they are a great resource. And in this letter he says he wanted to create a place where it looked like one could ruin oneself, a devil's furnace. And we have this kind of eerie fishbowl lens perspective, all of these kind of garish colors, these isolated individuals. Van Gogh, or gosh, I'm sorry, Gauguin actually painted the same scene, but instead of that fisheye kind of panorama, we see a different view, but that same feeling, a little bit of kind of desperation or kind of unease in his work here as well. Van Gogh and Gauguin's friendship and time together in Arles was short-lived. They fought. They had periods of real strife and contention, and we see a little bit of that in Van Gogh's self-portrait here with the Bandagier in 1889. This is, of course, the after the violent argument with Gauguin, where Gauguin cut off part of his ear and he gave it to a prostitute. Now, I don't want us to think that that Van Gogh's work is only a result of his unstable mental health. He really only painted during times of emotional and mental stability, including his final major work, Starry Night, that was painted while he was recovering in a mental clinic in Saint-Remy, about 20 miles from Arles. This is a period of calm, and it's a scene based on observation, but also exaggerated and abstracted to elicit deeper meaning. Van Gogh committed suicide in the following year. He often wrote to his brother, who financially supported him, and he felt like he was a failure. He felt like he was a burden on his family, that he would never sell anything. And of course, what we know now is that he is revered as a quintessential avant-garde artist. Somebody who was driven mad, a martyr for his ambitions of the avant-garde, misunderstood by society. And it's true, he never sold a work while living, but almost immediately after his death, becomes very popular and influential for future generations of avant-garde artists. And if you have not seen the recent film about Van Gogh called Loving Vincent, I highly recommend it. It is a fully oil-painted animation based on Vincent van Gogh's letters. It is fantastic. It would be such a great thing to watch during this time of staying home. All right, the final work here is Cezanne. And if you take our 212 with me, we're going to come back to Cezanne in my 212 classes, because he's so important for Cubism, an early 20th century avant-garde movement. And what we see in Cezanne's work is something that the Cubists really capitalize on, and that's that feeling of skewed perspectives, multiple vantage points, multiple light sources, this idea that there's not a single vantage point here. I mean, look at the table. So here we see one line of the table. Okay, that seems to connect, but then we have this line that doesn't have a matching contour. Over here, that also doesn't really line up. It seems like the different planes of the table aren't even. Cezanne is doing that intentionally. He wants to fracture the picture plane. He wants us to think of the picture plane as a place that's not cohesive, but presents multiple viewpoints. And he takes scenes like a still life or his many images of the mountain Sainte Victoire. He does these solid scenes over and over again, but presents a multiplicity of viewpoints. All right, for your primary document reading this week, you are reading a short excerpt from Baudelaire. Please note, don't read just read the sections that are called The Artist, Man of the World, Man of the Crowd, and Child. Don't read the beginning of the section Modernity on the last page. Baudelaire is such an influential figure. He is not a practicing artist himself, but closely connected to these artists here of the late 19th century in France. And he develops an idea of modern life and modern living that is so crucial to these art movements. And so I want you to describe, think about how Manet describes the artist. How should the artist act? How should he behave? Similarly, I want you to think about this person he describes as the flaneur. And how does the flaneur live? How does this person exemplify modern life? And below, I'm showing you a painting by Manet, who is a close friend of Baudelaire, of a garden, a public park in Paris that often held outdoor concerts. And I want you to use this as kind of inspiration here for your reading. So best of luck finishing up the semester. Please be in touch with me. Let me know what I can do to help. And I look forward to hearing from you.